Okay, welcome to lesson 3 of module 2, and we are going to be looking at how we move towards World War II today. We're going to be fighting and ending a European war before we end module 2, so we still have a lot of work to be done. We're going to be looking today, or in this particular lecture, particularly at how we get into the war and what the European front looks like. Make sure to make note of your identifications only to this time, and be prepared to look at those as we go along. So in order to discuss how we get involved in World War II, we have to pause on America for a few minutes and look over at what's happening in Europe. The 1920s and 1930s are a very busy time in Europe. We've talked about what's been going on in the United States, but what we haven't talked about is the fact that after World War I, most of Europe was in total economic disaster, particularly places like Germany and Italy. And throughout the recovery process there have been a lot of fascist dictators who have taken over. For instance, in Italy, we have Mussolini, who basically invents fascism, which is this idea of dictator-controlled, regulated government or political system that's going to become very popular in Italy, in Japan, in Germany. And so we have, out of this economic turmoil, these very dangerous leaders taking power in some of these very key countries. So there's a lot that's happening. We're going to focus specifically on Germany because obviously that is where the most important developments are happening. Adolf Hitler in Germany, he is incredibly frustrated by how World War I ends. Particularly the fact that Germany was blamed for the entire war and assigned all of these war reparations. If you remember, I told you when we talked about the Treaty of Versailles that that would be very important in how we begin World War II, and it is because Hitler is furious about the embarrassment that was put on Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles. So he, throughout the 1920s, he tries to take power. He ends up getting put in prison as a result of it. He comes back in the late 1920s, and he starts to politically campaign for power in a legal way, and he actually is appointed as Chancellor of Germany legally. At that point, he begins to make all of these laws that consolidate his power in Germany and make him essentially the dictator of Germany very quickly. He will then begin to violate the Treaty of Versailles almost immediately, first with something that's called rearmament. Germany's military was limited by the Treaty of Versailles. He's going to begin to expand the military outside of those limitations. He's also going to take back the land that Germany lost to France in the Treaty of Versailles, called the Rhineland. He'll do that in 1936. In 1938, he branches out and he annexes Austria and the Sudetenland, which basically means he just makes them part of Germany. There's no war, but he kind of forces them to become part of Germany through intimidation factors. And as this happens, Britain and France are looking on and they're concerned, and so is the United States, but they're not doing anything to stop Hitler. And we call that appeasement, which is one of your terms. Appeasement is what's happening in Germany in the 1930s. Britain and France, they don't want another war, and they know that Hitler is capable of waging another war, and they're hoping that if they give him these few little things to make him feel better about Germany's condition, that he will be appeased and that he will stop there. And so they don't act early on, hoping that if they ignore it, it will just go away. But of course, it doesn't just go away. In 1939, Hitler will sign the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact with the Soviet Union, which you might think is actually a good sign, but it's a terrible sign because if you think about a map of Europe, you have Germany kind of in the middle, the Soviet Union over there on the right, Britain and France over on the left. And what we know is that Hitler anticipated that eventually Britain and France were going to attack him for what he was doing, and he didn't want to have to fight a two-front war with the Soviet Union on the other side as well. So he signed a peace treaty with them. And Britain and France, they look at this and they say, we have to do something. So they send him a message that says, look, we've given you this much room. We're not going to do anything about what you've done so far, but if you invade Poland, that's going to be the last straw. We will declare war on you. And Hitler says, all right, I understand. And then in 1939, he invades Poland. And that is going to be the beginning of World War II as Britain and France declare war against Germany. Germany allies with Japan, who's trying to take over in Asia, and Italy, who's just trying to survive. And they become the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And then Britain and France, and eventually the Soviet Union, will become the Allied powers. And we have World War throughout Europe once again. Now, America's take on all of this is that we don't want to get involved. We're isolationist. We believe that World War I involvement was a mistake. We don't want anything to do with World War II. And to prove it, in 1935, as we anticipate this coming, we passed the Neutrality Act that says that we are not allowed to sail on ships of countries at war, and we're not allowed to sell weapons to countries at war. This is an attempt to keep us out of the conflicts that are brewing. But in 1939, those acts are going to come to an end when the war actually breaks out, because we are going to be lured by the economic aspects of being involved in the war. We desperately need wartime jobs. We need to produce for the war. We need the trade with wartime countries to re-stimulate our economy. And so we try to stay out of things but still participate economically by developing policies like cash and carry. Cash and carry says, okay, you have to pay cash for the goods that you're going to buy from us, the war items that you're going to buy for us, so that we don't have money tied up, no loans or anything like that. You have to buy cash or pay with cash, and you have to send your own ships over here and pick up the stuff that you want and carry it back yourself so that we don't risk American ships. And so we try to stay neutral through that. But by 1941, it will become clear that these countries are running out of cash to pay us with. And so we have to develop a lend program. And so we developed the Lend-Lease Act, which basically says, okay, we're just loaning you this, and then you guys can give it back to us later. And so we're still not really getting financially tied up in the war. We're just loaning you these things. It's very difficult to loan somebody bullets. How are you going to get those bullets back? But it's a way for us to try to keep our distance while still being involved in the war. In August of 1941, Roosevelt, who is still president, he's going to participate in the Atlantic Charter, which is a meeting between him and Churchill, who is the prime minister in England, and they are deciding what the war aims are for when the war is over. And it's clear that through the Atlantic Charter, it's clear that Roosevelt is anticipating that the United States is going to end up being drawn into the war, just like they were in 1941. And in many ways, Roosevelt wants the United States to be drawn into the war because he believes that it's the only way that we're going to stop Hitler. And so while the American people, once again, don't want to be involved, the American president does. And this brings us to Japan, because it will be Japan that ultimately brings us into World War II. It's important to understand the context for the Pearl Harbor attack. See, it was about oil. Japan gets 80% of its oil from the United States because they have very few of their own natural resources. But in 1941, the United States makes this decision to cut Japan off from all trade, including oil. We do that knowing that it will hurt the Japanese war effort. And the Japanese people see this as an active war against Japan by the United States, of economic warfare. So they threaten to invade Indochina, or Indonesia, as you would more commonly call it, and get their oil. The United States retaliates against that and says, no, not only do you have to stay out of Indonesia, but you've got to stop your war in China, and you've got to sign non-aggression pacts with everybody and pull out of the war altogether. Otherwise, the United States is going to continue to prevent you from getting oil. And so from the Japan perspective, the United States is antagonizing Japan and attempting to interfere with its war efforts. And so it retaliates with an attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7th of 1941. Japan will send 60 ships and 360 airplanes over to Pearl Harbor with the intent of completely wiping out our aircraft carriers, which are usually stationed in Pearl Harbor. Aircraft carriers are vital for military equipment. They're carrying airplanes, they're carrying a lot of ammunition, they're carrying a lot of stuff. They're very important. And Japan intended to target those and really limit the United States' ability to mobilize for war if they should choose to. But on the morning of December 7th, 1941, those aircraft carriers were out on a training operation in the open waters. They were not at the harbor. And so when Japan attacks, all they actually do is damage 8 American ships and small vessels. And, of course, they do kill 2,400 people and wound 1,200, which is very significant. So it's still a very damaging attack, but it doesn't have nearly the impact that Japan had hoped that it would. However, it does succeed in absolutely infuriating the American people, so much so that they are actually demanding that Roosevelt declare war on Japan, and therefore on Japan's allies of Germany and Italy. And so Roosevelt says that what this attack does is it solves the, quote, terrible moral problem that he was in. That moral problem is that he believed that the United States needed to be involved in the war, that it had to responsibly be involved. But the American people didn't want it. Well, now they were demanding it. And so Roosevelt goes to Congress and he asks Congress to declare war. Congress does, and in December of 1941, we officially enter World War II. The Japanese are going to suffer a huge backlash for what they did at Pearl Harbor. And to be clear, regardless of how the Japanese felt about our interaction with oil, they did not have a right to attack the United States. They felt justified in that, but they were not, in fact, justified. So there will be a backlash against the Japanese where we will begin to put the Japanese Americans in internment camps out of fear that perhaps they are enemies of the United States who are working for Japan. And so Executive Order 9066 expels all Japanese from the West Coast. 110,000 men, women, and children are put into internment camps. And there is a lot of anti-Japanese propaganda that will appear in the United States as we demonize the Japanese people. The only area that we do not remove the Japanese from is Hawaii, because they are so vital to the economy there that the Hawaiian economy would have collapsed if we had removed all the Japanese peoples. And so just like we did with the Germans in World War I, we will expel the Japanese into internment camps, which will become a national embarrassment later on. I realized that this was not an appropriate reaction. At the time, however, the American people are fully on board with interning and containing people who they view as a threat to American safety. Now that's the end of our first lecture on how we get into World War I, and World War II. We will pick up with the remainder of this content when you're ready in the final lecture for this